The sound came first, a crack like thunder echoing inside the hollow tower, followed by the screech of metal tearing away from concrete. Men on the ground looked up to see the top of the scaffolding beginning to peel away from the wall, spiraling in both directions like a ribbon unwinding. In 30 seconds, 51 workers and 166 feet of steel, wood, and concrete would collapse into a tangled mass at the bottom of the tower, creating the deadliest construction accident in American history. This is the story of April 27th, 1978. The day the Willow Island cooling tower collapsed. The day an entire community buried its sons, brothers, and fathers. But this story begins long before that Thursday morning, with warnings ignored, corners cut, and a race against the schedule that would cost 51 men everything. The Ohio River Valley in the 1970s was the beating heart of American industrial power. Coal-fired plants lined the waterway, feeding electricity to factories and homes across the eastern United States. Pleasant's power station at Willow Island, West Virginia, was adding to this empire. 2 massive natural draft cooling towers that would serve generators producing 1,300 megawatts of power. These weren't ordinary structures. Hyperbolic cooling towers stand among the most challenging engineering projects in construction. The tower at Willow Island would rise 430 feet into the sky, with a base diameter of 109 meters. The walls would curve inward in a graceful hyperbolic shape, then flare out again at the top, a design that creates natural updraft to cool the power plant's water. Research Cottrell Incorporated, a New Jersey-based firm, had won the contract. They were the best in the business, having successfully constructed 36 cooling towers using their proprietary lift-form system. The first tower at Willow Island had been completed without incident in August of 1977. Tower number 2 was progressing on schedule. Meanwhile, the construction method was revolutionary. Instead of building scaffolding from the ground up, the traditional approach, Research Cottrell's system bolted directly into the concrete tower wall itself. The scaffold would hang from the partially completed structure, suspended by anchor bolts embedded in yesterday's concrete pour. Every day, workers would pour a 5-foot section of concrete, called a lift. After the forms were removed, the entire scaffolding system would be raised and bolted into this fresh concrete. The next lift would then be poured on top. Day after day, the tower climbed higher into the West Virginia sky. By April the 27th, 1978, Tower number 2 had reached 166 feet. 28 lifts had been completed. Lift 29 was scheduled for that morning. Lee Steele was a retired construction laborer who had raised his boys to work with their hands. Strong Christian beliefs held the family together through hard times. 4 of his sons, Larry, Ronald, Ernest, and Miles, worked construction at Willow Island. His brother Emmett worked there too. So did 2 of Lee's brothers-in-law, 3 nephews, and a teenage grandnephew. 10 members of the Steele family climbed the scaffolding that Thursday morning. They were among 51 men who reported for work on Tower number 2. Concrete workers, form carpenters, steel workers. Most were local boys from Pleasants County, men who went to church on Sunday, coached Little League and stopped for coffee at the same diner every morning. The oldest was 61, the youngest was 18. Some had worked together for years. Others were new to the crew, learning the trade through word-of-mouth training that was standard practice on construction sites. None of them knew that OSHA inspectors had warned of disastrous consequences at this exact site 13 months earlier. None of them knew that critical anchor bolts were missing from the scaffolding system. None of them knew that the concrete supporting their lives had only 1/5 the strength it needed. Instead, they climbed. 166 feet up the inside of the tower, stepping onto the 4 levels of scaffolding that wrapped around the interior wall. The morning was cold for late April. Temperatures had dipped near freezing overnight. The concrete poured yesterday afternoon, lift 28, had been curing for barely 20 hours. What happened at Willow Island wasn't a surprise to everyone. In March of 1977, more than a year before the collapse, an OSHA inspector visited the site during construction of Tower Number 1. He found no evidence that the scaffolding would hold its intended load. He noted that the single temporary stair tower created an escape hazard if workers needed emergency exit from the scaffolding. A second inspection that same month found the scaffolding badly in need of repairs. Some repairs were being made without knowledge of the engineering department. The inspector's report warned of possible disastrous consequences. Meanwhile, nothing was done. No follow-up inspections. No enforcement actions. The warnings sat in an OSHA file while construction continued. Tower Number 1 was completed. Tower Number 2 began rising toward the sky. Robert Stuhlberg, a young lawyer with Ralph Nader's Public Citizen Health Research Group, would later discover these documents while poring through OSHA records. He called it substantial evidence that OSHA knew the scaffold posed serious hazards to workers. The agency had the information. They had the authority. Instead, they had only 20 federal inspectors covering the entire state of West Virginia. But there were other warning signs visible to anyone paying attention. The construction schedule was aggressive. Workers were paid for exactly 8 hours per day, no matter how long the actual work took. This created pressure to rush through safety procedures, to skip time-consuming concrete tests, to keep the tower climbing on schedule. The contractor was using a new technique and guarded it jealously. They didn't even keep the construction blueprints on site, afraid that competitors might steal their proprietary methods. Without detailed plans available for reference, workers made modifications on the fly, relying on memory and habit rather than engineering specifications. Worse still, no single person bore responsibility for process safety at Willow Island. The Governor's Commission would later find that there were no inspectors or supervisors whose job was to check the work and determine whether to proceed. No one was testing whether concrete had achieved minimum safety strength before raising the scaffolding. No one was verifying that anchor bolts were properly installed. The system had worked 36 times before. That morning, it would fail catastrophically. At approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, workers on the ground began hoisting the third bucket of concrete up to lift 29. Each bucket held 2 tons of wet concrete. The crane atop the scaffolding pulled the load upward, the cable straining against the weight. Suddenly, the cable went slack. Men on the ground looked up. A worker facing the north rim saw a section of the top ring of concrete let go. What happened next occurred so fast that eyewitness accounts blur together into fragments of horror. The the concrete began to peel. Not crumbling, peeling like someone opening a tin can. The section started unwinding counterclockwise, then shifted to spiral in both directions at once. Lift 28. The concrete poured less than 24 hours earlier. Couldn't hold the weight of the scaffolding, the workers, the crane, and the rising bucket of concrete. The entire section had tore free from the tower wall. One witness on the ground said it sounded like a train derailment. Another said he looked up and it was just... John Peppier, working at ground level, heard concrete falling first. I looked over my left shoulder and I could see it falling. I could see people falling through the air and everything falling. The 4-level scaffolding system, secured to lift 28 by anchor bolts embedded in inadequate concrete, ripped away from the tower in a cascading failure. Steel beams, wooden forms, fresh concrete, construction equipment, all of it plunging into the hollow center of the tower. 51 men fell 166 feet. The entire collapse took less than 30 seconds. Witnesses describe people falling through the air like dominoes. Only 7 men inside the tower survived. All of them at ground level, protected by luck and positioning. The 51 on the scaffolding had no chance. The distance was too great. The weight of falling steel and concrete too crushing. Many could only be identified later by the contents of their wallets. Emergency crews from St. Mary's arrived first. 3 units, 24 trained personnel. But there was nothing to do except begin the grim work of recovery. Fire departments from across the region responded. Workers from other parts of the power plant rushed to help, then stood helpless before the tangled mass of steel, wood, and concrete that had, moments ago, been their co-workers. By mid-afternoon, a makeshift morgue had been set up in the Belmont Volunteer Fire Station. Families gathered in a Sunday school building that had been converted to a crisis center. Old men, young women, middle-aged mothers, children, all waiting for news they already knew in their hearts. Dr. Eula Bingham, head of OSHA, flew to the site that same day. She would later recall arriving to find family members crammed into a tiny building, their faces glazed with shock. "They looked at me with glazed eyes," she said, decades later. "I was so taken with this that even today I want to cry when I think about it." President Jimmy Carter asked Bingham personally about Willow Island. She started to describe the technical details. Carter interrupted her. "It was green concrete, wasn't it?" he said. She confirmed. "Yes, Mr. President, it was." Pleasants County began burying its dead on Saturday, April 29th. Services were held at churches throughout the county. 5 members of the Steele family, 4 brothers and their Uncle Emmett, were laid to rest side by side at Willow Island Cemetery. Their graves face north toward the cooling tower that killed them. Reverend Amos McVeigh described them simply as good men. Prior to the funeral, President and Mrs. Carter called the family to express their condolences. Governor Rockefeller did the same. Senator Robert Byrd extended sympathy through the mayor. Meanwhile, even as funerals continued through the following week, investigation teams were already sifting through the wreckage. Lee Steele had lost 4 sons, 1 brother, 2 brothers-in-law, 3 nephews, 10 members of his family, gone in 30 seconds. "We was very close, me and my sons," he told reporters. "I just trust in God. He'll never put more on me than I can bear. But the grief wasn't contained to one family. The community of Willow Island and surrounding Pleasants County had lost 16 residents. Newport lost 2 more. 33 other families scattered across the region were planning funerals for fathers, sons, brothers. Walter Carpenter, then teaching science at St. Mary's High School, remembered the moment news reached his classroom. Some students had fathers, grandfathers, and uncles working at the power station. We tried to console the children as best we could, he recalled. Many of them just wanted to charge out of the school when they heard the news. All teaching stopped. It was just impossible to go on. The National Bureau of Standards investigation began immediately, commissioned by OSHA to determine the technical cause of the collapse. Their team conducted on-site inspections, laboratory tests of construction components and concrete specimens, and detailed analytical studies. The investigation divided the structure into 3 sections: the hoisting system, the scaffolding system, and the tower shell itself. The hoisting system was examined first because the failure appeared to initiate at Cathead Gantry No. 4, where concrete was being lifted. Laboratory tests on the hoisting cable, static line, chain hoist, and anchor devices showed that the hoisting system did not cause the failure. Next, investigators examined the scaffolding system. This complex structure contained the concrete forms, scaffolding framework, and hydraulic jacking system that allowed the entire assembly to be lifted for each new pour. Meanwhile, the lift-form scaffolding showed no inherent design flaws that would have caused collapse under normal conditions. That left the tower shell itself, specifically Lift 28. Investigators recreated the conditions of that morning. They mixed concrete identical to what had been used, subjected it to the same near-freezing temperatures that had prevailed on April 26th, and tested its strength after 20 hours of curing. The results were damning. The concrete had achieved only 220 pounds per square inch of compressive strength. The minimum required to safely support construction loads was calculated at more than 1,000 pounds per square inch. The National Bureau of Standards concluded that the concrete should have been allowed to cure until it reached at least 2,000 pounds per square inch, providing a proper safety factor of 2. Instead, workers had bolted a massive scaffolding system, supporting the crane, the workers, the forms, and rising concrete into concrete that had barely 1/5 the necessary strength. But the investigation also revealed other contributing factors. Anchor bolts were missing from critical connection points. Some bolts that remained were of insufficient grade to handle the loads. The hoisting system's static line, which prevented the concrete bucket from swinging, had been moved from near the base of the tower to near the center. This created dangerous side forces on the scaffolding that the system wasn't designed to handle. Perhaps most damning, there was only one access ladder for emergency exit. When the collapse began, workers had no way to escape. They were trapped on a failing structure 166 feet above the ground. Meanwhile, not everyone agreed with the National Bureau of Standards findings. United Engineers and Constructors, the general contractor, hired Lev Zetlin Associates to conduct their own investigation. Their conclusion contradicted the government report entirely. Lev Zetlin Associates claimed the collapse wasn't caused by weak concrete. Instead, they argued, workers had removed anchor bolts too early from lift 27, the section below the failed lift. These bolts secured the jump form beams that transferred loads from the scaffolding to the tower shell. If the bolts had remained in place, Lev Zetlin Associates insisted, the collapse would never have occurred. The discrepancy sparked a battle over blame. Was this a failure of concrete curing, or a failure of worker training and supervision? The contractor wanted to shift responsibility to worker error and lack of oversight. The government investigation pointed to systemic failures in the construction process itself. In 1980, two of the original National Bureau of Standards investigators conducted additional analysis to address Lev Zetlin's claims. Their conclusion was unequivocal. Even if all the anchor bolts had been perfectly installed and left in place, the collapse would still have occurred. The concrete strength was so far below what was needed, 1.5 megapascals versus the required 6.9 megapascals. That failure was inevitable. But perhaps the most explosive revelation came from Robert Stuhlberg's investigation for Ralph Nader's group. Within days of the collapse, Stuhlberg had obtained OSHA inspection reports from March of 1977. The documents showed that federal inspectors had visited Willow Island during construction of Tower No. 1 and had specifically warned that the scaffolding system posed serious hazards. OSHA had known. 13 months before 51 men died, a federal inspector had documented the danger and warned of potential disaster. Yet, no enforcement action was taken. No follow-up inspection occurred. The warnings sat in a file while Tower No. 1 was completed and Tower No. 2 climbed toward its fatal height. The Governor's Commission on Willow Island was furious. Commission members demanded answers from OSHA officials who refused to respond, citing the ongoing federal criminal investigation. The Commission was especially angry that OSHA wouldn't immediately inspect other cooling tower construction sites across the country to ensure the same techniques weren't being used elsewhere. What they appear to be saying is, don't bother us until someone is killed or injured. Commission member Cook said at an April 1979 press conference in Wheeling. On June 8, 1978, just 42 days after 51 men died, OSHA issued citations against the Willow Island contractors. 20 violations total, 10 willful, 10 serious. The proposed penalty was $108,300. Willful in OSHA terminology means the violation was intentional or made with plain indifference to the law. The agency found that Research Cottrell had knowingly failed to test field-cured concrete specimens before removing formwork. They had knowingly failed to properly anchor the scaffolding system. They had knowingly proceeded with construction on concrete that hadn't achieved adequate strength. The contractors settled the case for $85,500. That works out to approximately $1,676 per dead worker. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $8,300 per life in today's currency. Meanwhile, OSHA referred the case to the United States Department of Justice for criminal investigation. This was the worst construction accident in American history. Federal investigators had concluded that contractors knowingly violated safety regulations. Families waited for someone to be held accountable. A grand jury was convened. Evidence was presented. Months passed. No charges were ever filed. Not against Research Cottrell, not against United Engineers and Constructors, not against any supervisor or safety officer. 51 men died from violations that OSHA deemed willful and that federal inspectors had predicted a year in advance. No one spent a single day in jail. The families were devastated. They had been kept at arm's length throughout the investigation, receiving little information, excluded from decision-making processes. The Governor's Commission noted bitterly, "The families have been held at arm's length and have been ignored. Being the biggest losers, we feel it should have been the other way around." Civil lawsuits followed, of course. Workers' compensation claims, liability settlements. But the full extent of damages and insurance payouts was never made public. The West Virginia Department of Insurance declined to provide information even decades later. The men were dead. The companies paid relatively modest sums. Life went on, except for the families who would never be whole again. So, what really happened? The National Bureau of Standards' final report, issued in November of 1979, laid out the sequence of failures with scientific precision. Lift 28 had been poured on the afternoon of April 26th. Overnight temperatures dropped to near freezing. Cold temperatures dramatically slow concrete curing, the chemical process by which cement bonds with water to create a solid structure. By 10 o'clock the next morning, the concrete had been curing for approximately 20 hours under adverse conditions. Laboratory tests showed this gave the concrete a compressive strength of about 220 pounds per square inch. Meanwhile, analysis of the construction loads, the weight of the scaffolding, the crane, the workers, the forms, the rising concrete bucket, and the dynamic forces of hoisting operations required concrete strength of at least 1,000 pounds per square inch. Properly, a safety factor of 2 should have been applied, meaning the concrete should have reached 2,000 pounds per square inch before proceeding. When the third bucket of concrete began rising that morning, the additional dynamic load exceeded what the weak concrete could bear. The analysis showed that the collapse initiated at the section of Lift 28, where cathead gantry number 4 was located. At several points in that section, calculated stress exceeded the concrete's strength in compression, bending, and shear. Once failure began at those critical points, it propagated rapidly around the entire circumference of Lift 28. The investigation also confirmed that moving the static line anchor point from near the tower base to near the center created additional side forces. If the anchor point had remained in its original position, the report noted, the effects of the construction loads would have been reduced to such an extent that the failure of Lift 28 would probably not have occurred. But even this wouldn't have saved the tower if the concrete strength remained so catastrophically low. The fundamental problem was simple. They built on concrete that hadn't finished hardening. The schedule demanded a 5-foot lift every 24 hours. The cold weather meant concrete couldn't achieve adequate strength in that time frame. Something had to give. On April the 27th, 1978, what gave was Lift 28, and 51 men paid with their lives. Willow Island changed American construction safety forever, though perhaps not as much as it should have. OSHA implemented new regulations requiring detailed construction plans for cooling towers and similar structures. Concrete must now be tested before forms and shoring are removed when the concrete will carry construction loads. The so-called 70% rule emerged from this disaster. No loads can be applied to freshly placed concrete until it reaches 70% of design strength, verified through concrete test cylinders. The regulations also mandated that formwork should not be tied together across an entire structure. This lesson was reinforced when, not long after Willow Island, a cooling tower under construction at Satsop, Washington experienced a similar failure. 2 workers were killed, and a third, seriously injured, when a steel form pulled away from the tower. If the forms had all been tied together as they were at Willow Island, the death toll would have been far higher. Construction of the second Willow Island cooling tower eventually resumed. For years afterward, a visible line marked the exact point where the tragedy occurred, a permanent scar in the concrete structure. Workers who returned to finish the job had to climb past that line every day, knowing exactly what had happened there. A memorial was erected along Route 2, within sight of the towers. 51 names are carved into the monument. Families still visit, leaving flowers, standing in silence before the list of the dead. The power plant itself operated for decades, a daily reminder to the community of what had been lost. The plant was scheduled for closure in 2019. West Virginia's legislature intervened, providing $12.5 million per year in tax breaks to keep the plant operating. It finally closed on June 1st, 2023. Instead, in late August of 2023, the power station reopened under new ownership, with plans to convert it to hydrogen production. Meanwhile, the tower that killed 51 men still stands. Drivers along Route 2 can see it from miles away, a massive concrete structure rising against the West Virginia sky. Most people pass without knowing its history. But in Pleasants County, in St. Mary's and Belmont and Newport, the memories remain. There's a human calculation that transcends engineering analysis and legal settlements. Lee Steele lost 4 sons in a single morning. He attended 5 funerals in 1 week. 4 brothers buried side by side, facing the tower, their uncle Emmett a short distance away. How do you measure that grief in dollars? How do you compensate a father for watching 4 of his children lowered into the ground on the same day? One family lost 10 members. Other families lost fathers, sons, brothers. A high school teacher watched his students learn that their fathers weren't coming home. A community of a few thousand people buried 16 of their neighbors in a matter of days. The oldest victim was 61 years old. The youngest was 18, Brian Taylor, barely old enough to vote, working construction to save money for his future. That future ended at 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning, 166 feet above the ground, when concrete that should never have been loaded began to fail. The men of Willow Island weren't taking extraordinary risks. They weren't skywalkers or deep-sea welders or any of the dangerous specialties that accept high risk for high reward. They were building a cooling tower using a proven system that had worked 36 times before. They showed up for work, climbed the scaffolding, and trusted that someone had made sure it was safe. That trust was misplaced. OSHA had warned of the danger and done nothing. The contractor had skipped concrete testing to maintain the schedule. No one verified that anchor bolts were properly installed. No single person bore responsibility for ensuring the partially completed structure could support construction loads. 51 men died because a system that should have protected them failed at every level. In 1985, at a reunion of workers and families in West Virginia, survivors shared their memories. One worker who had been on the ground that morning described hearing the crack, seeing the scaffolding start to peel, watching helplessly as co-workers fell. "I can still hear it," he said. "That sound stays with you." Another worker recalled the aftermath, the desperate digging through rubble, hoping against hope to find survivors, finding only bodies. "We knew most of them," he said. "You'd find someone and you'd recognize their boots or their jacket. That's how you knew who it was. The Steele family graves at Willow Island Cemetery are well maintained. 4 brothers in a row: Larry, Ronald, Ernest, Miles. Their Uncle Emmett nearby. Fresh flowers appear regularly, placed by family members who still remember, who still mourn, who still cannot comprehend how one morning took 10 members of their family. Dr. Eula Bingham, who led OSHA at the time, carried the memory of Willow Island for the rest of her life. In a 2016 interview about her career in occupational safety, she broke down describing the families she met that day. There were mostly old men and young women, middle-aged women, older women, and children sitting there. They looked at me with glazed eyes. I was so taken with this that even today I want to cry when I think about it. She died on June 13th, 2020, having spent decades advocating for stronger workplace safety regulations. But Willow Island remained her greatest failure. The disaster that happened on her watch, despite warnings her agency had documented and ignored. Today, if you drive along Route 2 in Pleasants County, West Virginia, you'll pass the memorial to the 51. You'll see the cooling tower rising against the sky. For years, you could see the visible line marking Lift 28, where the collapse began, a scar in the concrete that workers and community members could point to and say, that's where it happened. That's where they died. The deadliest construction accident in American history. 51 men who climbed the scaffolding one Thursday morning in April of 1978. None of them came down alive. And the tower they died building still stands, a monument not to American industrial power, but to the cost of putting schedule over safety, profits over people, and progress over human life.